A deafening roar tore through the stillness of the desert. A military jet thundered overhead, rattling the windows of the Burro Bend diner and snapping Charlie Klusker out of her daze. She shielded her eyes, tracking the blur slicing across the sky. Another Strike Eagle jet, probably out of Luke Air Force Base. She guessed he was still fully loaded and hadn't dropped his payload yet. "He's really low," she muttered under her breath, the sound already fading into the silence it had broken, as if the sky had swallowed the jet. Heat shimmered in waves. Rust-colored dust hung in the air like ghosts, and strange noises always seemed to linger in the distance. Charlie, 19, sat alone on a sun-warped bench outside the Burro Bend diner, a weathered gas and grill outpost, clinging to life on a forgotten stretch of desert highway. Tucked miles from the nearest main road, it was surviving on truckers, desert wanderers, and those who still believed in mom-and-pop stops. Dust clung to her boots, and the wind tangled the waves in her sun-bleached hair. Her dirt bike leaned beside her like a loyal companion, both of them weathered by miles and heat. She stared toward the distant mountain range, motionless, watchful, but always scanning the horizon with the restless gaze of someone born with the desert in their bones. Always searching, always waiting for something just out of reach. On her way inside, Charlie grabbed a dusty stack of mail from the mailbox, sorting through it with a casual flick of her thumb. When the red ink caught her eye, she flipped through envelopes that exclaimed, "Final notice. Foreclosure warning." The red stamps were like warning flares. The weight hit her harder than the sun. They were out of time. Inside, her mom paced, stress pinching her voice. She had to drive to the bank in Yuma and try one last time to delay the inevitable. The house, the diner, everything was on the line. A voice called out from the far room. Gravelly and worn, yet stubbornly alive. It was her grandfather. A World War II vet slouched in his creaky wheelchair by the back window. "If you need money, then it's time we go dig up my treasure," Grandpa said as he tried to hide his excitement. Charlie scoffed and rolled her eyes. "Yeah, sure, Grandpa." Everyone in town knew him as the eccentric old vet, the one always rambling about buried treasure and shadowy military conspiracy secrets. Charlie had grown up hearing the same far-fetched tales 100 times. But tonight, something was different. There was a spark in Grandpa's eyes, not madness, but memory, a flicker of fire that hadn't burned in years. As the sun sank behind the dunes and distant coyotes cried into the dusk, Charlie found herself doing something she never expected. Listening. The old man leaned forward, his voice dipping into a reverent hush. He spoke of a long-lost Spanish galleon from 1615, a pearl-harvesting ship that had sailed north up the Gulf of California into what was once Lake Cahuilla, a vast inland sea that has long since dried up. Grandpa explained that this whole area would have been underwater back then. Unbeknownst to the Spanish sailors, though, the sea they sailed in on had already begun to evaporate. The ship became stranded in the silty basin. It was too heavy and too late to escape, so the crew was forced to abandon it in the sand. Grandpa looked at Charlie, smiled softly, and said, "My great-grandfather Charles saw it with his own eyes. He said it was 100 feet long, its sails were tattered, but still proud. You were named after him, you know. Charlie C. Klusker. Initials CCC, just like yours. He was tough as nails and lived to be 105. He had fire and determination. You got that from him too. I know you don't believe me, Grandpa said as he leaned back. Well, there's even an old newspaper clipping from 1870 exclaiming that my great-grandfather found the ship. Charlie's interest perked up. She once saw a carving of a ship, etched into a rock deep in the desert. A memory resurfaces of a strange petroglyph she once stumbled on during a childhood hike with her mother. Charlie wasn't convinced, but something about the story stuck. What if it was actually out there? That night, sleep won't come. The desert feels alive as it whispers to her, pulling at her restless thoughts. As the first light bleeds over the horizon, Charlie throws on her pack, jumps on her dirt bike, and rides into the unknown. There was something out there she needed to see again. She tore across the desert like a bullet. She needed space and she needed answers. The desert opens like a forgotten scroll. It was wide, endless, and humming with wind and ghosts. Charlie rides fast, past sleeping tumbleweeds and brittle canyons, until she finds it. The petroglyph rock outcropping. It was weathered and faint, but clear. Etched into the surface, there was an Indian petroglyph depiction of a Spanish ship, the same one she remembered seeing as a young girl. And just below it were 3 small initials: CCC. How had she missed them before? Could those really be her great-great-grandfather's initials? Maybe Grandpa wasn't so crazy after all. She races home, her blood pounding. Grandpa is waiting, as if he already knew. He speaks softly, his voice low and steady, and tells her about a place near the Salton Sea, a secret test base where he'd been stationed during the war. It was the kind of place no one talked about. Not then. Not now. He leans in, eyes distant as he describes it. A base that clung to the mind like a bad dream. They called it the Salton Sea Test Base, codename Sandy Beach. But it had always been much more than that. Remote, silent, intentionally forgotten. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was one of the most sensitive military installations in the entire Southwest. During the war, it served as a site for testing early cruise missile prototypes, amphibious warfare tactics, and even atomic weapons simulations. The Salton Sea Base had been among the first in the U.S. to rehearse the deployment of nuclear weapons, long before most people even knew what the word nuclear meant. They practiced bombing runs using what were called dummy bombs, non-nuclear replicas of the devices that would one day devastate Hiroshima and Nagasaki. According to official reports, the bombs were inert, not dangerous, no uranium, no plutonium, and no radiation. Just shape and weight for practice, or so they claimed. But for the soldiers stationed there, the doubts never really left. Rumors swirled like dust storms. Some said the soil glowed faintly at night. Others told stories of animals, dead or deformed after certain test drops. A few men fell ill, then vanished from the records. Their names were erased. Questions were discouraged and met only with silence. They were told, just training accidents. Forget it ever happened. And they did. Because no one wanted to be the one who asked a second time. Some believed it was a sister site to Los Alamos. Others whispered that it was California's own Area 51, complete with downed aircraft, secret labs, and tunnels stretching deep beneath the desert floor. Grandpa recalled things they saw, things they weren't allowed to understand. Most of the men he served with didn't come back with stories. They came back with silence. That place, he said, It gets under your skin. It still does. But then, Grandpa told Charlie about a moment in time he would never forget. One night, sometime in the middle of 1942, a message crackled through Grandpa's radio. A young couple had gotten their car stuck in the most restricted area of the base. Civilians, lost in a place they should never have reached. No one could understand how they'd gotten that far. There wasn't even a road out there. But the sky was black with rain. Monsoon weather swept across the land, mud thick as glue, and someone had to go out there. Grandpa was the night guard on duty, so the responsibility fell to him. He remembered how his headlights barely pierced the downpour, how the tires skidded over washboard trails, and how the entire desert smelled of mesquite and wet earth. He almost missed the car completely. Half buried, its rear end sunk deep into the ground. There was no road, only a drowned expanse of sand and clay. There was no moving the vehicle. Realizing they couldn't stay in the restricted zone, he offered them a ride into town. He'd made a promise to return after the storm passed and the ground had dried. He'd dig it out himself if he had to. Days later, with the sun blazing and the desert transformed back into a cracked, sun-baked skin, he set out for the stranded car. But the land had shifted. The flood had redrawn the desert's layout. Dunes had moved. Paths had vanished and new washes carved unfamiliar scars into the earth. The old trail was gone. So he picked a new one and set out on foot across miles of foreign terrain back into the restricted zone. Somewhere along the way, his boot caught. He stumbled forward and caught himself, then looked up. The barren land had given way to a bizarre scene, a strange garden of mounds rising from the sand, scattered like ancient offerings. He described it later as an otherworldly pumpkin patch, the only way he could make sense of it. That's when he saw the glint, sunlight catching the windshield of the car, still half swallowed by the earth. He approached and began to dig. The desert was dry now, but the car wouldn't budge. It was locked in place as though welded to the earth, its undercarriage gripped by sand like the flood had buried it alive. As he worked, his shovel hit something unexpected. Wood, old weathered planks, buried beneath the surface. He hesitated, confused. What were wooden boards doing out here in the middle of the desert? Maybe someone dumped them long ago. But they were smooth, clean-edged, and too intentional. He set a few aside for traction and used one to wedge behind the tire. Then the shovel struck again. Another solid object, but not metal. Wood. Dropping to his knees, he cleared the sand with trembling fingers. More planks, structured and layered. Not natural, not random. These didn't belong out here. Not this deep, and not in this kind of formation. And that's when the old family story returned to him. The tale of the Spanish galleon, lost in the ancient sands of the Cahuilla lakebed. A shipwreck in the middle of the desert. Could these planks be part of it? His hands worked faster, fingers scraping at something just beneath the wood. More timber that was flat, carved, bound. A box, or perhaps a chest. His heart raced. Could it be real? Had he, like his great-grandfather Charles, stumbled across the ship? The long whispered treasure that was passed down in rumors, clippings, and half-believed stories. He could already see it. Coins tumbling into dust, gems catching sunlight, a buried fortune from another world overflowing with riches. But then, the question, the one that stopped him cold. What were the odds that a random car got stuck in this exact spot, right above a buried chest, in the middle of nowhere? Could it be coincidence? Or had someone known? Had someone deliberately chosen that spot? He sat back. He suddenly felt uneasy out in this desert alone. If it wasn't chance, then who else knew? And why bury it here, beneath land no one was supposed to cross? His stomach turned. He was deep in restricted territory. Reporting it meant the chest would vanish into government hands. Trying to retrieve it could mean arrest, or worse. So he did the only thing he could. He reburied it. Carefully placing the planks back, smoothing over the sand until the ground looked untouched. Then he pulled out his field log, a small, green, military-issued notebook. He marked the location with a crude X where the car had been. He labeled it simply, Pumpkin Patch. A strange name, yet unforgettable. It would be his breadcrumb for when he returned. He slipped the notebook back into his jacket and headed back toward his post. Back at the base, he told the commander the truth, as much of it as he dared. The car was hopelessly stuck and no recovery possible. Within days, the area was sealed off, as if the land itself needed to be erased. The couple was told their vehicle was a loss, and that was the end of it. Not long after that incident, Grandpa fell ill. Charlie studied his face. There was a weight in his eyes. He'd always wondered whether the treasure had cursed him, or whether it was protected by something far older and far more dangerous than time. Charlie, wide-eyed and breathless, asked if he still had the logbook. Grandpa just smiled, said it might still be in the garage, tucked away with the old newspaper clipping, assuming her mom hadn't thrown it out. The next morning, Charlie tore through the garage, digging into dusty trunks, old uniforms, and faded maps. If she could find that paper, or the old field log, then maybe the treasure was real. Maybe it could save them. She had to find it. Buried beneath family photos, she found it. A crumbling newspaper from 1870, its headline shouting, "Lost Ship in the Desert," and nestled beside it, a battered, stained green logbook. One entry stood out. It was describing a stranded vehicle, a rescue, and a strange place marked simply, Pumpkin Patch. No directions, no map, no coordinates. But for Charlie, it was enough. Fueled by hope and desperation, she began packing her gear, preparing to set out toward the top-secret military base before dawn. The ride had started easy, empty arroyos stretching out like ribs across the land, and Ocotillos danced in the early light. Charlie hadn't been on the road more than an hour when something started crawling up her spine. At first, it was just jet noise overhead. Nothing unusual out here. But then came the shadows. Blackhawks, low-flying, cutting fast across the horizon in sharp formation. Their blades beat the air like war drums, kicking up spirals of dust in their wake. Then another kind of aircraft appeared, unfamiliar, almost alien in its design. It hovered low, spitting sand into violent walls around it. 2 3-bladed rotors mounted on its wings, rotating and tilting at taking off and landing with no tail rotor. Not like anything she'd seen before. And maybe not something that belonged to our military. Charlie killed the engine and dropped behind a rock outcrop, tucked near the base of a ridge, every nerve on fire. Then came voices, garbled through radios, followed by the crunch of tires on sand. Humvees, a whole convoy of them, moving slow and deliberate above her on the ridge. It felt like they were searching, not for something, but for someone. Charlie stayed still until the last sound faded. Even then, the feeling didn't leave her. A twist in her gut said she wasn't alone. The sky, the ridgelines, even the earth itself, it all felt like it was watching. She waited, eyes sweeping the landscape. The sun slipped low. Shadows stretched long, reaching like claws across the sand. And then Mother Nature made herself known. The wind came first, then the clouds, rolling in thick and biblical. The temperature plummeted, and her skin stung. What had been a still, searing desert became a tidal wave of storm and fury. Lightning forked sideways across the sky as the rain erupted in sheets. The washboard trail beneath her vanished into muck. What had once been earth turned to soup. She pushed the bike now, boots dragging through sludge, rain blurring her vision, and her helmet echoing with the pounding of water. Finding shelter was all she could think of now. Somewhere on the horizon, something rose. The outline of buildings and a tall fence. The base. Heart hammering, she used the storm as cover to creep closer to the fence. She edges her dirt bike along the barbed wire until she found an opening just big enough for her and the bike to slip through. She slipped inside, mud-caked and breathless, as the sky exploded overhead and visibility dropped to near nothing. A narrow trail wound ahead, half washed out and overgrown. Tumbleweeds and dried brush seemed to grab at her feet as she moved forward. A cluster of wind-battered Palo Verde trees offered a flicker of shelter. But it wasn't enough. Then, a shape began to emerge through the veil of rain. It looked like a squat, concrete building. Squinting through the storm, she saw it for what it was. A bunker-like guard shack. She pushed toward it, thunder cracking overhead like artillery fire. The windows were filmed with grime. The door sagged half open as she slipped inside, dragging the bike behind her. The air was thick with dust. Rust-painted streaks ran down the walls. A chair sat frozen at the desk, untouched. A cot rested in the corner, filthy but intact. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Clearly no one had used this shack in a very long time. But it was dry, and that's all that mattered to her. Charlie barricaded the door with a sandbag and collapsed onto the cot, clothes soaked and clinging to her skin. No fire, no food. She couldn't risk it. If they were looking for her, she didn't want to give them any sign. Outside, the storm continued. Every sound made her flinch. The wind howling like ghosts, thunder cracking like incoming bombs. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard a siren. Maybe not. But with the siren came more voices, faint and distant. Somewhere in the storm. They weren't close, but they weren't far. It sounded like a murmur beneath the thunder, muffled like underwater echoes, or whispers through the earth. She strained to listen. The voices came in fragments, half-formed syllables with a rhythm she couldn't place. Was that a different language? Or just the wind? She didn't know. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was exhaustion. The desert has a way of playing tricks on your mind. The silence inside the shack felt crowded and alive. Then, a tap. Sharp and subtle, but she definitely heard tapping. It was enough to shoot her upright. Silence followed. She pressed her ear to the wall, but heard nothing. She found a lantern near the cot. It was old, but it worked. The soft glow lit up the cabinet. One drawer hung open, rattling with each gust. Annoyed and unsettled, she crossed the room to push it shut. But something inside stopped her. A file tab, faded and brittle, caught her eye. Typed neatly across it. Klusker, classified. The name froze her in place. This was about Grandpa, it had to be. The folder felt ancient in her hands, the paper thin and yellowed with age. Inside, she found documents inked with red stamps, lines blacked out, and an official seal she didn't recognize. Technical language dominated most of it. Coordinates, jargon, dates from the 40s and 50s. but one line tore through the rest. Asset present during recovery test incident. Subject recommended for non-disclosure tracking. Civilian connection noted. Charlie's breath caught. Grandpa hadn't just been here. He'd been part of something. Something they didn't want remembered. She glanced at the rest of the cabinet. More files, more secrets, but only this one bore his name. And now she wasn't just chasing his story. She was inside it. Had they been watching him all along? And if they had, what did that mean for her? The helicopters had to have seen her yesterday riding across the desert. She slid the file into her pack. If they caught her now, there would be no explaining this. She returned to the cot, heart still in her throat like a lump. Outside, as the storm continues to rage, while the desert whispered truths. Tomorrow, she'd follow the trail, but right now, she desperately needed rest, even if rest came with one eye open. By the time the sky began to pale with the first hints of dawn, Charlie was already lacing her boots. The answers were out there, somewhere in the hollow belly of the base, and she was ready to find them. The secret installation stretched out before her like a great beast, but instead of a hive of activity, it lay in a kind of haunted stillness. The quiet wasn't natural. She had braced herself for alarms, for guards, for security dogs, and the buzz of surveillance cameras. But none of it came. The air was sharp. The silence felt loaded, like a breath held too long. Dilapidated buildings lined the path, some collapsing inward, others stripped to bare frames, empty husks left behind by men with secrets. No lights, no movement. No sign that anyone had walked these grounds in years. She left the bike behind in one of the structures, better not to risk drawing attention, and slipped into the ruins on foot. The old runway unfolded before her, cracked and fading beneath her boots. Faint paint lines clung to the eroded surface, remnants of a time when this place buzzed with motion. A low hiss of wind threaded through the rusted control tower, and the hangar to her left leaned like a drunk on its last leg, stinking of oil and dust. Noises broke the stillness. A faint crunch echoed in the silence, then another. Footsteps. Her breath caught. She spun, but saw only shadows. A subtle click, like a camera shutter, snapped through the air and her skin flushed. A shape moved across a building's shattered wall. Too fast. Too quiet. Instinct took over and she ran, feet pounding across the fractured tarmac, heart thundering, breath ragged. Behind her there was breathing, but it wasn't hers. Yet every time she turned, there was nothing. A heavy steel door offered shelter ahead, and she ducked through it just as it slammed shut behind her with a sound that echoed like finality. A long hallway stretched deep into the bowels of the structure, lined with doors half sagging from their hinges. One creaked open on its own, slow and deliberate. She froze. The wind slithered through vents, rattled glass, stirred ceiling panels that drooped like old skin. Somewhere metal clinked in rhythm. A mechanical hum hummed from nowhere, or everywhere. Her footsteps sounded too loud in that hallway, like they belonged to someone else. She peeked inside a room that revealed a storm of papers and upturned chairs, desks disheveled in haste. Another held cracked sinks and fractured mirrors. A red handprint smeared the wall. Hopefully, it was paint. She hesitantly tried a light switch. It didn't work. She tried another in the hall, but it was clear there was no power here anymore. A rusted panel hung nearby, its guts of wiring bared and dead. She pressed onward, fingertips grazing walls that flaked under her touch. The place felt abandoned, yet not empty. It was the kind of quiet that made you nervous. Somewhere down the corridor, a locker door banged open, and she twisted on her heel. Still no one. Her breath stayed shallow, the hallway closing in tighter the deeper she went. Then came the ceiling groan. A black blur dropped like a hammer, and she barely ducked in time as a bat sliced through the air and vanished into the dark. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. This wasn't just a base. It was a mausoleum of forgotten things. Out a shattered window, she caught a glimpse of a red light. It flickered, sweeping like a slow, deliberate scanner. It slid across a distant building before vanishing into the dark again. It reminded Charlie of a laser beam. With no working lights and no generators, there was no reason for that beam to exist. Charlie backed away from the glass slowly and hastened her step through the corridor. She came upon a doorway marked Command Center. Inside, chaos reigned. Broken radar units, ancient paperwork, and maps bearing red warnings cluttered the room. Some papers detailed nuclear tests, radiation zones, and blacked-out regions with cryptic designations. Suddenly, Grandpa's cancer diagnosis didn't seem so random. Desks were still dressed in decay, old computers lifeless, files scattered across warped floors. The room groaned as she crossed it. One bulletin board dominated the far wall. At its center hung a dusty frame, nearly consumed by webs and time. She stepped close, her hand sweeping away the layers. The image revealed was a base diagram, zones marked in ink: armory, barracks, hangar, chocolate mountains, restricted zone, quicksand. The next words she read, though, seemed to pop off the page: pumpkin patch. She stopped breathing for a moment. The name Grandpa had spoken in reverent tones, the term she'd never understood. It was here, a real location. Etched on the map in black ink and red borders, northwest of the runway and deep inside the restricted zone. But why was that region more restricted than any other? Why no access points, no roads, no explanation? Thick red lines marked its borders, making clear these were warnings, not guidelines. She leaned in. No labels, no buildings, just danger. The words Grandpa had once whispered returned, heavy with implication. I wasn't supposed to be there. Nobody was. The chill in her spine deepened. She traced the map with trembling fingers, pulled out her compass, and checked her heading. Then, she turned and vanished back into the corridor shadows. The ruins swallowed her as she moved. Whatever lay inside that restricted zone, she had to find it. She had to save the Burrow Bend. The desert once again stretched before her, vast and unbroken, an empty canvas beneath a merciless sky. Her footsteps crunched across bone-dry earth, each step carving a rhythm into the stillness. Boots heavy, ankles and feet aching with every step. The only sound was wind, dry and relentless, like a hot whisper. The hours dragged. Eventually, doubt began to settle in. The map, the heading, her instincts. All of it suddenly felt off. Charlie paused. Her breathing was shallow, and her muscles were tight with fatigue. She slid the pack from her shoulders, checked her compass again, and took a long sip of water. That's when the terrain began to change. The sand gave way to jagged clusters of stone and scattered boulders, misaligned and unnatural, like remnants of something otherworldly. The colors shifted subtly, shadows deepening, the light bending in strange ways. She had reached the edge of something different. It didn't feel like the same desert anymore. The ground ahead swelled into bizarre shapes, rounded, blistered mounds that rose from the earth like petrified balls. Stone formations that didn't belong, They looked like pumpkins, a frozen garden of them. She slowed her pace. This was it, the pumpkin patch, the place her grandfather had described. It had always felt like myth, like some private hallucination of his past. But here it was, real and silent. And somewhere nearby, if his stories were true, there would be a sign, proof. Charlie scanned the eerie landscape. Her eyes locked onto a shape, irregular, broken, slumped against the ground. It wasn't gleaming. It didn't call attention to itself. The thing blended into the desert, rusted and sun-bleached like a ghost lost in the dust. But it didn't belong. She dropped flat, slipped the binoculars from her bag, and adjusted the focus with steady fingers. Wind tugged at her hair as the lenses clarified the image. There it was. Half buried in silt and sand were the bones of a car, old and twisted, but unmistakable. A grin threatened at the corners of her mouth, grim, disbelieving, and a little wild, because somehow, impossibly, it was true. Grandpa's words returned, faint and scratchy, like a memory carried over radio static. The easiest treasure map in the world, kiddo. That car? That's your X marks the spot. And now, with the pumpkin patch behind her and the wreck before her, Charlie felt it deep in her gut. He might have been right. She moves closer in a low crawl, careful not to disturb a single pebble. When she finally rises, she's standing before it. A 1940 sedan, the same one that got stuck that rainy night in '42. The one that stranded a scared young couple on a live military base during the war. She's actually standing in the same place, with the same car. The one Grandpa couldn't dig free. The one that was supposed to be hiding the treasure beneath its belly. She reaches out and places a hand on the hood. It's hot and dry. Rusted chrome curls away from its frame like flaking bark. The tires long devoured by the desert. Cracked, but still here, like it had waited for someone to come back. For a second, just a second, Charlie can almost see her grandfather, young and desperate, shouting orders as rain pounds around them, trying to rescue that couple in a storm. The vision is short-lived and vanishes with the wind. Charlie swallows hard and grabs her shovel. She has work to do. The first scoop of sand is shallow and easy. The second, a little harder, a little heavier. By the 10th, her arms are burning and shaky. Sweat drips into her eyes, stinging, but she has to keep going. The sun slides lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the car, as if Grandpa is standing over her with quiet encouragement. Each dig takes more effort as the earth fights her. She was running out of strength when she hit something that made a thunk. That sound wasn't rock, and it wasn't metal either. It sounded like wood. She drops to her knees and claws at the sand with both hands. Sand slides under her fingernails. Her arms are limp and don't seem to want to cooperate. More wood appears. She tries to pick it up, but it disintegrates in her hand. Were these the planks? The next few minutes are a blur. She digs faster, more frantic, sand flying in every direction. Then her hands hit something solid, wood edged with metal. Her head started to spin. Was it the anticipation, or was the heat getting to her? She widened the pit, her fingers working faster now, scraping back the desert's grip. In her mind, she pictured what Grandpa had described so vividly, the big, bountiful treasure chest that he believed he'd stumbled upon decades ago. A heavy, sea-worn trunk, brimming with gold and pearls. A box so grand, it could have anchored a legend. But as the last of the dirt fell away, reality offered a humbler prize. It wasn't a grand chest at all, and no ornate carvings. Just a small wooden box, a little bigger than a shoebox. Dark with age, its joints bowed and swollen from years buried beneath the heat and weight of the desert. The metal bands edging it were tarnished and barely holding. Charlie stared in disbelief. Confusion flickered behind her eyes, quickly followed by curiosity. Whatever this was, it had been sealed and hidden with intention. This wasn't just someone's forgotten lunchbox. Charlie cradles it like a relic. She kneels beside the sunken chassis of the car, resting her back against the wheel well. For a long moment, she just breathes. Her hands tighten on the latch. She can almost feel Grandpa with her. Is this it? The wind picks up again, whispering across the pumpkin patch, like it knows what comes next. The box creaks as she lifts the lid, but inside, there's no shine, no jewels, no Spanish gold, just dust. A faded bundle of cloth, a rusted miner's chisel, a bundle of old denim jeans, a knife, a thick old bottle, and a small satchel. And the scent wafting out was of tobacco and dirt. Buried treasure? Not what she was looking for, and definitely not what Grandpa envisioned. Exhausted and deflated, she headed home. Charlie limped into the diner, filthy, sunburned, clothes torn. She was worn to the bone. Inside, her mom was locked in another battle with the bank. Grandpa sat in his wheelchair by the back window, watching the horizon like he was still waiting for a miracle. She dropped the old box on the table. Dust rose as memories spilled out. Nothing glittered, nothing shone. Just scraps of cloth, metal, and wood. Her shoulders slumped, the weight of failure pressed down. The pumpkin patch, the car. They were all real. But there was no treasure out there. Grandpa wheeled over to the table, eyes sharp despite the years, and lifted the denim with both hands. Fingers brushed away time, revealing a faded patch barely clinging to the waistband. Levi Strauss and Company. The buttons confirmed it. They were authentic 501s from the late 1800s, the kind he heard collectors would pay big money to own. He guessed they were old miners' jeans from the nearby Tumco mine. Charlie stared, blankly. Had she actually brought something back? Something that was real and valuable? Grandpa's face broke into a grin. Not a big one, but it was genuine. His smile filled Charlie with something she had been searching for. Hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe it was enough to settle the debts. Enough to save the Burrow Bend. She wanted to feel proud and triumphant, but all she felt was empty. She wanted to believe. She needed to believe. But in that moment, it all felt like a wild ghost chase, a dying man's fading memories, a desert fever dream or a mirage of glittering treasure. Her hands were raw and her chest was hollow. The desert had taken so much. She had brought back scraps, nothing more. She reached for the old leather satchel, ready to return it to the box, but something shifted in her hand, stiff and hidden. Her fingers found a seam, a flap tucked into the lining, stitched down and sealed with a brass button. She peeled it back slowly, leather cracking like old bark as it revealed a small square of hide. 3 faint letters had been burned into it. CCC, her great-great-grandfather's initials. Her breath caught. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't random. He'd been there. So had Grandpa. And now, so had she. She unfastened the loop with shaking hands while the leather unfolded like it was surrendering a secret. And nestled inside, a single imperfectly round coin, heavy and golden, its face worn nearly smooth by time, a Spanish medallion, a doubloon, real and undeniable, and beside it, 3 black pearls, dull in the light, but unmistakable. She could only stare as words were escaping her. The galleon, the myth, the story Grandpa never stopped telling. It wasn't just a ghost tale. Part of it, at least this part, was real. She looked up. Grandpa hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. He knew, she knew. They had found something. But the coin, the pearls, they weren't an end. They were just the beginning. A whisper from the past, beckoning her back to the silence, back to the heat and the hush of the desert, back to the shifting sands and the mysteries that still waited. Because somewhere out there, maybe beneath another forgotten dune, or buried beneath decades of wind, the rest of the story was still waiting to be found. The ship, the loot, the truth. The desert still hums and the wind still carries secrets. And Charlie, no longer just a girl chasing legends, had become part of the legend, herself. The desert doesn't always give you what you want, but if you listen, it gives you what you need. Charlie found a legacy buried in sand and time, a rusted memory, a classified treasure.